Hello, everyone. My name is Rob Higurita, and I'm a Principal Technical Account Manager at AWS, and I'm based out of Austin, Texas. Welcome to AWS Supports You, where we share best practices and troubleshooting tips from AWS Support. Joining me today is Raj from AWS Support. Can you give us a quick introduction, Raj?
Sure. Thanks, Rob. Hello, team. My name is Raj, and I'm a Principal Technical Account Manager, and I'm based out of New York City. And I'll hand it over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Raj, for the quick intro. And so today we'll be introducing you all to infrastructure event management, or IEM, and some best practices. We'll specifically focus on the best practices to prepare you on how to execute planned events such as shopping holidays, product launches, and migrations. But before we get into all those details today, a quick note to the attendees online. Please feel free to use the chat window on the right-hand side of your screen to share your thoughts and ask your questions throughout the episode. We really look forward to hearing from you. And drop us a note on where you're joining us from today, and that'd be great. So, Raj, can you go ahead and walk us through what we're going to be talking about?
Cool. Thanks, Rob. So, I have worked with customers on global product launches, especially at scale. And I would like to share the learnings from these launches as best practices in this session. So, in our session today, we'll go over the best practices during the preparation phase and run phase of planned events. So, when I say planned events, these are events such as shopping holidays, product launches, and migrations. Any of these could fit into planned events, and it could be of different scale. And during these launches that you have, AWS Infrastructure Event Management, or what we call as IEM, is there to support you during these events. So let's first talk about what is IEM, or Infrastructure Event Management. So, what is an IEM? AWS Infrastructure Event Management offers architecture and scaling guidance as well as operational support during the preparation and run phase of planned events. And again, these planned events, just to reiterate, these are shopping holidays or product launches or migrations. Anything that you anticipate ahead of time and you want to plan for these events, predominantly from a scale perspective, where you think that it's going to drive a lot of traffic to these events. So for these events, IEM will help you assess operational readiness, identify and mitigate risks, and complete your event confidently with AWS experts by your side. When I say AWS experts, those experts could be AWS technical account managers, AWS solution architects, and sometimes service specialist, or maybe an SME from a particular service, or an overall integration perspective. This program is included in Enterprise Support Plan and is also available to business support customers for an additional fee. If you are planning for a high profile or high impact launch, or if you expect spike in load, reach out to AWS to discuss how we can help you with our infrastructure event management or AWS well architected reviews. So let's talk a little more in depth about IEMs. So AWS experts lead a highly focused engagement to provide you with architectural and operational guidance for your planned event using a prescriptive and phased approach. So what do I mean by prescriptive and phased approach? We first work with you to understand your success criteria and desired business outcome. This is something that customers decide, that you decide, and let us know. And then we work backwards from that. And then we assess the readiness of your environment. This is the footprint that you have on AWS, and help identify and mitigate risks that are identified during the initial course of readiness, and also help you to document your plan for the activity of the event. And then once you do these, and once you follow on with us, you confidently run your event with the AWS experts by your side. And then once the event is done, we help analyze the results post event and scale the services to normal operating levels. That could be any level that you might design, and so that you could focus on your planning for your next event. That could be within the same infrastructure, or maybe a completely a new event that you may want to plan. How do you engage with AWS? You can reach out to your technical account managers in case of enterprise support, or account managers, whoever is your point of contact for AWS, and discuss on infrastructure event management for your next planned activity. Let's talk about timelines and how it works. So during the initiation phase, that's the phase one, right, where we were talking about, that is when AWS supports helps you to work and understand your success criteria, and then work backwards from that in terms of what do you want to achieve during the event or after the completion of the event. Then during the planning phase, that's when we work with you on the readiness activities of your AWS environment, and then help you identify what are the risks that we anticipate, so that we can plan for the mitigation just in case if that risk was to happen, and then document the plan in terms of how do you want to run the event. And then on the day of the event, now that we are done with all the planning, on the day of the event, you confidently run the event with AWS experts by your side. Like, we do work with you alongside during the event, available for you on the conference bridges, or maybe chat and email methods of communication, so that you have someone to reach out to just in case if there are some issues. And then after event, as we discussed earlier, this is when we get back to normalcy in terms of the scale. So we help you analyze what are the results post event, and then scale the services to the operating levels so that you can focus on planning for your next event. As you can imagine, in these planned events, the key is operations at scale. I will put or bucket this into this particular terminology called operations at scale. Because if you see what is the variable that is driving all the activities in these planned events, it's scale. And obviously it's the ongoing operations that you would handle during the period of the launch. So for a seamless operations at scale, we approach the planned events as follows. First, we work with the support coordination activities. This is again coordinating with different teams internally and externally. That could be from the customer side, that could be on AWS, and also in some cases, you may have to interact with partners and coordinate ahead of time. And then the second thing is on security. As we all know, security is job zero, and that's pretty important to work in case of events or in case of deployments and so on. And then we understand the scaling pattern. This is primarily to work with you on what your scaling strategies are, and how would you handle those challenges that may come in with the scaling operations. And then as you work on scaling up your services and other infrastructure footprint, one thing that you would notice is how do you manage the limits? Not just AWS, but this is pretty common in any SaaS offerings or other vendors, where there are limits that are set. We will talk in detail about limits, why is it there, and how you could handle it. But at a very high level, that is another activity with regards to operations at scale in terms of limits management and scaling services. And then architecture review. This is very much focused towards the resiliency. Obviously performance and other characteristics comes in to the equation, but we are pretty much focused on resiliency and working backwards from that. Is the application following well architected principles, and are there any optimization initiatives or opportunities for optimization? And then finally, load testing. This is where you benchmark your infrastructure for the anticipated load, and doing load test at a production scale, if you will. We'll talk about that in detail, but broadly, these are the set of activities that encompasses the overall operations at scale. Now, now that we went through IEM and what it entitles, before we move forward with best practices, I want to take a pause in here to see if there are any questions. The next section or the subdivision is going to be on best practices. But before we go in there, just wanted to take a pause and see, Rob, are there any questions before we move forward?
Hey, Raj. Yes, thanks for the information so far. And we do have a question that just came in actually from JibJab06. Their question is, what is the time commitment of an IEM for for their side as a customer, right? They saw kind of 6 to 8 weeks before the event, but how much time do they actually need to invest, and how much does AWS handle?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a good question. In terms of what is the time commitment from the customer side, right?
Hmm.
So, first thing is that I do want to, before I get into the time commitment expected from the customer, I do want to emphasize on a fact that it is important to engage with AWS as well as your partners ahead of time. As much headway you get into the event, let's say you have an event coming up, maybe in the next quarter, you have like a 3 months notice, right? It is better to give that notice to all the partners and also AWS ahead of time, so that we don't have to do any rushing activities at the end. We
Hmm.
have enough lead time to do the coordination. Now that's a key pointer, right? Then let's move on to what kind of time commitment that customers can expect. I'll go through different phases so it's pretty clear. So, we were talking about four phases, right? Like requirements collection, initiation, and then actual event and post event. So, during the requirement collection phase, right, as soon as you engage with AWS, that is what we call it as requirement collection, basically trying to understand what your end goals are and working backwards from that. And that requirement collection phase, we are talking about anywhere between 6 to 8 week period, right? So during this period, what we expect is that we would like to have a single point of contact, if you will, on the customer side. And the primary intent of having a single point of contact is to make sure that we have a continuity, because not all the events are going to just start and end within a week's time or so. There are long running events which could go to months, or repetitive events. So we want to
Hmm.
have like a single point of contact who we can reach out to. That could be, when I say single point of contact, it need not be just one person. It could be two people or a team that we would interact with. And that time commitment from this particular individual we are talking about, or the team, the single point of contact, is going to be 6 to 8 week period. Now, when I say 6 to 8 week, it's not going to be like all 8 hours in a day or like all 5 days in a week, right? But that is the longevity of the engagement. And it all depends on what kind of an event that we have. And it varies from one event to other. And a disclaimer here is, whatever that I'm going to say here is a ballpark figure, and it could completely vary depending on the scale of the event as well as the longevity of the event. That pretty much drives it. And then the second piece is at the time of customer facing activity that we do, right? Like from AWS side, we do have certain customer facing activity. Those happen in parallel with internal activity. That could be like VTAMs could be working with support teams or service teams, or maybe there could be a joint engagement with one of the partners. Maybe the customer is having a monitoring partner, and we may have to discuss with them what is the monitoring dashboard and so on. So this activity, right, this happens in parallel. So the time commitment is going to be maybe 1 hour or 2 hours in a day, where we do a daily checkpoint, understanding what are the activities that are happening, and how do we proceed for it's mostly checkpoints where we talk with the customer. But majority of the activities, I would say, from a time commitment perspective, comes during the initial phase of requirement collection. And what we have seen in most cases is that if there's a structured documentation available, if there is a documentation on architecture and what is the deployment strategy looking like, if that is all more structured, the time commitment is going to be less from the customer side, because it's already available. If not, then customers may have to reach out to internal teams on their side to get these documents,
Hmm.
coordinate, and share that with us. And again, one of the things that I would highlight here is, if you're working on a product launch, right, it is not just going to be one service team. There could be 6 or 7 service team on your side, on the customer side, that all bundles together for one product. And it could be, when I say six, it could be many teams, right? So each of their teams have their own architecture, and in some cases all of this architecture is put in brand new. But in few other cases, for product launches, it could be the existing platform, but there could be a new component that got added. So in that case, the time commitment is going to be very less, because we would have already reviewed the infrastructure platform, and this could be just one service team that we would have to work with. But broadly,
Mhm.
we are talking about a 6 to 8 week time commitment from the customer side, and it varies depending on the engagement in terms of which teams that we interact on the customer
Yep.
side.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Raj. Audience, please make sure to post your questions still, continuing on as we move forward. Though, Raj, I'll let you take it and continue through the rest of your presentation. Thank
Cool. Awesome. So we are moving on to best practices. Now that we have a very good understanding of the planned events and how AWS infrastructure event management supports you during these events, let's look at using infrastructure event best practices. So the first one, the first best practice that we are going to talk about is early engagement. So now, with early engagement, what do I mean by that, right? I touched upon this in the previous slide. Here, early engagement means you as customers engaging with different parties ahead of time. That could be AWS, that could be a vendor who you want to discuss ahead of time before the launch, and this is all in anticipation of the event. And why do you need an early engagement? It helps us to coordinate with different teams, right? When I say it helps us, but from AWS perspective, it helps us to coordinate with the different teams, both on customer side as well as internally. And the same principle applies for other third party suppliers, your vendors, and even your internal service team. So giving a broad notification to all the required parties early helps us to plan for the event ahead of time. Now, this also helps us to discuss about the scaling strategies ahead of time. There are multiple scaling strategies that we will look into in future slides, but at a very high level, we do want to discuss different scaling strategies, right? In terms of what works best for you. That could be a custom scaling strategy that you might have, or that could be an on-demand scaling strategy that we will discuss further. And then the early engagement, as I said earlier, it is applicable for all the parties, and that's a key pointer that I wanted to call out. And it is not just for AWS, all the parties who are involved in the event, giving them an heads up. Maybe you could be using multiple CDN providers. That's a good example, right? So in that case, giving a heads up or a notice to all the CDN providers ahead of time helps all of them to coordinate internally and also communicate that with you ahead of time. We'll post a couple of links in here. Those are the links for the enterprise support page, as well as how do you contact us. But pretty much the options that you have are engage with your technical account managers or the AWS representative on how we can help you with the infrastructure event management, as well as maybe it could be an well architected review, or doing a review or a deep dive on a specific architecture that you have deployed. The next best practice that we're going to talk about is architecture review. It's a good segue as we spoke about the early engagement. AWS well architected helps cloud architects build secure, high performing, resilient, and efficient infrastructure for a variety of applications and workload. Now, the well architected is built around six pillars, such as operational excellence, security, reliability, performance efficiency, cost optimization, and sustainability. Now, AWS Well Architected provides a consistent approach for customers and partners to evaluate architectures and implement scalable designs. Now, a common question that comes is, hey, what is the AWS Well Architected tool? You spoke about Well Architected. Is there a tool that we can use? Yes, there is a tool, and the AWS Well Architected tool lets you review your workload, against AWS best practices and obtain the advice on how to architect your workloads for the cloud. This tool uses the AWS well architected framework. Now, I spoke about workload, right? So there is a common question like, hey, what is a workload? A workload is nothing but it's a collection of resources and code that makes up a cloud application that you have deployed. And how can we get started with AWS well architected tool? You can access the well architected tool by signing into your AWS management console. And once you sign in, you can access the well architected tool from the drop down or going to that particular link or the service as you type in the console. And then you define the workload for which you want to perform the well architected review, and then you answer questions across each of those architecture pillars that we spoke about earlier. And this tool will evaluate your responses based on whatever responses that you have provided. The tool will come back with an improvement plan with a prioritized list of issues for your workload. And we will provide a link to AWS well architected here that you can use, that will have more details in terms of what kind of resources and how you can use the tool. And one call out that I wanted to make here is that as you are engaging with your solution architects, please don't think you're alone in this. The tool is a self-service tool. You can definitely use it, but at the same time, you do have solution architects who you can reach out to, number one. And number two is you can also reach out to AWS support through technical guidance and support cases where you can ask for recommendation. Hey, this is what I have deployed, and there is a recommendation to implement XYZ. What is the recommendation? How do I go about it? Right. So there are multiple engagements that you could have, both from solution architects, TAMs, and AWS support. So please do reach out to discuss further on your well architected requirements. The next best practice that we are going to talk about is contingency. As we all know that anything that could fail will fail. So contingency could happen due to a number of issues, and we want to make sure we are prepared. As we spoke about well architected, where we architect and make use of all the best practices, you never know when a disaster could happen. You never know when there is an issue. That could be through internal influence or external influence, but you never know when things could fail. So having a contingency plan is always helpful in case when you're planning for events. Again, this is a best practice for event management, but in generic perspective, as you architect workloads, when you follow best practices, it's also important that you have a clear outlined contingency plan. So what do we talk about contingency plan, right? There are three broad areas we are looking at. One is, what is the worst case scenario? If this worst case scenario were to happen, what is my plan to revert, or what is my plan to recover? And number two is, I did a code update, and there was a feature that was deployed as a result of code update, but what other downstream features that had to consume it that failed? So in that case, what is my rollback plan? So having a clear cut rollback plan is important, because during events there might be a ad hoc change you may want to do to the system, and in those cases, if you do that change, if that change caused some impact to end users, what is your rollback plan? And third, evaluate the DR options in cloud. So disaster recovery, or DR, is a process of preparing for and recovering from disaster. An event that prevents a workload or system from fulfilling its business objective in its primary deployed location is considered to be a disaster. I just wanted to give an overview of what a disaster is, right? So that we can plan for it. So we are going to give high level documentation around what are the options that is available in the cloud when it comes to disaster recovery. A continuation of contingency plan, as what you see here, is a spectrum of disaster recovery opportunities that we have, right? So, starting from the left spectrum to the right, what you see here is bare minimum backup and restore options that are available, which is applicable for low priority workloads, which is not considered very important to business and so on. And slowly, as you transition to the right, what you see there is about how the complexity increases as well as how the resiliency increases from your perspective on the recovery aspect. So, starting from backup and restore, you have a little more sophisticated pilot light setup where you have a kind of very minimal footprint in a different region, and then you can invoke that footprint and slowly transitioning it, having a warm standby environment in other region, and little more sophisticated, which is a multi-site active deployment. And as you see, there is a trade-off between your ability to recover versus how much you want to spend on cost, but it's a trade-off from a decision perspective. It's completely a business decision where you evaluate what options that you have from the spectrum and take a call according to your business needs for the specific environment. So, as you see, just to summarize, disaster recovery strategies that are available for you within AWS, they can be categorized into four approaches that you see here. That is ranging from your low cost and low complexity on the complete left, backup and restore, of making the backups to be more complex strategies of using multi-active regions on the right side. And it's completely a spectrum that is available for you to use. Now, before we move on, let me give a very high level overview in terms of regional failure, because when we talk about contingency, when we talk about disaster recovery, normally there are two topics that comes into equation, right? One is high availability, another one is disaster recovery. And often when we talk to customers on high availability disaster recovery, right, it's about how you envision or how you see the deployment as well as the resiliency. Here, when it comes to disaster recovery, we are pretty much focusing on multi-region or disaster recovery cross regions, right? That consider a region to be having issues, or you are able to understand what the customer impact in one region and how you are able to fail over completely to another region or evacuate a region. That is what we call about disaster recovery and contingency plan. So for that, what we need is, number one, have deployments in two regions. Again, here is a spectrum, but broadly our recommendation is that to have deployments in two regions, bare minimum. It could be more than two regions. Some customers deploy in multi regions, and some customers have some of their workloads in more than one region, which is two regions, one being primary and the other one being the standby or secondary, or both being active. These are different options, right? So having deployments in two regions and a mechanism to replicate the data across the two regions. So what do I mean by mechanism to replicate the data? We are talking about, let's say, the backend database. So let's say you have your backend database and Dynamo. So in that case, DynamoDB global tables is a good feature to consider, where you are going to look at the mechanisms to replicate the data across two regions using global tables. And let's say you have some static data on S3. So in that case, you look at cross-region replication feature within S3. Now, once you have a mechanism to replicate the data, the third thing that you will look into is a mechanism to handle the routing. Because let's say you have user traffic coming into your footprint to region A, right? In that case, you may want to remove all the user traffic from user A and divert it to the other region, which is region B. In that case, what is your routing mechanism? How are you going to handle those routing? And the example services that I would like to point out here is Route 53 routing policies, or application recovery controller in Route 53, the ARC in Route 53. So these are some options that you can look into on the routing mechanism. Then there could be a case where at the same time you're routing traffic to two regions, And at any point in time, when you have an issue in region A, you just want to evacuate traffic from region A and send all of the traffic to region B. So in that case, also, you need to plan that the region B is able to take 2x the traffic. So those are the planning considerations that you would do in advance when you think about contingency plan. The next best practice that we're going to talk about is the communication plan. This is not pretty much a technical deep dive. This particular best practice, it is pretty much from a process perspective, but having a good communication plan helps. And when I say it helps all the parties who are engaged. So how do I maintain a good communication plan? Here are some pointers that we have outlined based on some of the observations that we have had in the past engagements on infrastructure event management. For all events, as you understand, communications is the key, right? It could be communication from customer to AWS, or from AWS to customer, or maybe another vendor. And that could be a partner during the course of interaction that we would have. And as we spoke about this earlier, we would always recommend to have single point of contacts from different teams or different parties to interact during the different phases of IEM, that is from start to finish. And our recommendation is to have a regular cadence, and these cadence could be daily, weekly, as required, depending on the scale and complexity of the event. And it could also be changing as you proceed into the event. Let's say during the requirement collection, we may just start with like a weekly cadence, right? And then slowly, as we build up, we might have to have like a daily cadence where we have to collect more information. And slowly, as we get to the middle of the engagement, when we think that we have all the information that is required, maybe at that point we might have touch point communication with the customer leadership team. It may not be like a two-way communication. Maybe it's a one-way communication where we say, hey, these are the things that we have ready for you so that you could go ahead and test. Or it could be a communication from the customer side stating that, hey, we try to plan the service to X, but we are having some issues. Now, again, you don't have to wait for these cadences to happen. Your TAMs are available for you. Your support team is available for you to open up critical cases, depending on the severity and impact that you have. But these cadences that we are talking about here is just to continue the momentum and have the ongoing cadence on the pending issues that we have currently, or maybe a new issue that came up recently, so that there is enough eyes on that particular issue and we take that to resolution sooner. And having a registry of all the stakeholders for a seamless communication is recommended. And sometimes it is overlooked, where we may not have a clear registry. But what we have observed is that whenever there is a clear registry which we maintain and says that, hey, for monitoring, here is my point of contact to reach out to. And if something doesn't work out with the NOC or with monitoring, who is my escalation point of contact? So typically a single point of contact, and then having also an escalation charter that would help, like 3 columns for this particular activity or an entity or this particular service. Who's my point of contact and who's my escalation point of contact? And then the point of contacts we were talking about are leadership teams, ops managers, service teams, and support teams, and also NOC. The leadership team that we are talking about is from your side, so that you have established visibility to the planning phases, and then you communicate constantly with your leadership team. And AWS can also accompany in those meetings to give a status update in terms of where we are. It's a collective approach. It's not handed over to one party or the other. It's a collective approach where we have cadence meetings and provide the status updates to the customer and the leadership team. Now that we spoke about the communication plan, I want to take a pause here to see if there are any questions from the customer.
Hey, Raj, thanks. Yeah, we do have a question that came in from Mon Ramon 357. Welcome back, Mon Ramon. Mon Ramon was just wondering, can you talk about a customer event use case in the past that you've kind of worked through with a customer?
Sure. Yeah, there is also a use case or what we call as a blog post,
Mhm.
which we'll definitely share. So, Rob, if you have that link, you could share the same.
Yeah, I'll
And
share the link.
perfect. And I will give a high level overview on what an IEM was and how one of the customers used it. So in July 2021, GC or Government of Canada, they released the COVID Alert app and exposure notification application. And AWS account team and the technical team worked with CDS, which is Canada Digital Service, along with the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity and the Treasury Board of Canada, through well architected the framework that we were talking about earlier
Mhm.
and security reviews in preparation for the launch. And for this particular launch, there was also an IEM plan, an AWS infrastructure event management, that was put in place to offer architecture and scaling guidance in addition to operational support during the preparation and execution of the COVID alert launch. So this is a publicly available case study that you can use. And I can also talk about from my experience. I have worked with one of the customers on a global launch, and this launch again at scale. And essentially, if you look at the best practices that we are talking about here, these are based on those best practices that we acquired, or rather that we had as learnings from that launch. And obviously, not no need to say that the launch was successful. And there will be challenges. There were challenges during the launch, and the key to that is early engagement. Number one. And number two is clear cut communication on both the sides. As soon as there was a challenge, customer immediately notified support, and the TAMs were there. They were able to work with different service teams internally. And also, there was a case where we may have to engage with a partner, which we did through the customer, and we were able to get that issue resolved. And the key here is how much advanced notification that you can give and how soon you engage the respective teams support and so on, so that we'll be able to assist you on the events.
Yep, thanks, Rush. Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of great use cases out there online from past infrastructure event management, and we'll be sharing some links to those as well, so everyone can read some of the past ones that have gone well for customers in leveraging an infrastructure event management. So I'll let you continue through, Raj. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Rob. Getting back to the slide. So as we move on, the next best practice that we are going to talk about is monitoring. Effective monitoring measures how an application is performing, and the monitoring is critical to detecting the anomalies before they become problems, and it provides an opportunity to minimize the impact from adverse event. And that's why we bring in this best practice of monitoring here. And if you look at the broad picture of monitoring, again, there are definitely more nuances to setting up monitoring, but we want to call out some of the observations that we've had in the past. Setting up monitoring includes critical services for user experience. So this is again using the principle of working backwards, right? So you are delivering a service to your customer, and there is no point in all the services functioning as it could, but the end user is seeing some impact, right? So we want to work backwards from the end user perspective, like what is the experience for the end user, and that is for the customers, right? Because at the end of the day, we want to give the best experience for the end users on whatever services that we are offering to the customers. So from that perspective, consider what are the critical services for user experience. I may coin terminology as critical path to user experience, if you will, right? So let's say you have services such as CloudFront, backed by an ALB, and then you have behind the ALB you have web servers, and then DynamoDB, right? A broad architecture. So in that, and maybe there are some dependent services. You might be using API gateway, you might be using Lambda on the sides, and you might be using some downstream analytics services as well. Now, in the overall architecture, from an end user perspective, you want to make some recommendations for the end users, or the end users want to have the best experience, right? So in whatever services that I outlined so far, you might have like 3 or 4 services. Let's say I outlined like 6 7 services. Out of that, there could be 3 or 4 services that are critical to the user journey. When the user comes in, logs into your application, logs into your service, there are certain applications that are in the critical path of user journey. So it's important for you to identify what are those services, and make sure there is a priority that is given in terms of monitoring. Again, I'm not saying that you shouldn't monitor all the services, but from a priority perspective, whatever is going to create a huge impact to your end user experience, those should be given the top priority. And then you set up monitoring and notification mechanism. This is again to address the specific item of detecting the anomalies before they become a problem, right? So you want to monitor, and at the same time you need to set up a notification mechanism. It's going to be trial and error, and it's going to be a repetitive process. You set up notification, and then you see how it works, and then you may have to revisit and alter the notifications. And then you have to have a very good understanding of what is the traffic estimate versus what is business as usual. So today you might be experiencing, let's say, 1,000 concurrent users, right? So from that baseline or benchmark, how much is the traffic jump going to be? How much is the rate going to be? Is it going to be 2x? Is it going to be 5x? And then plan for it, and then set up a monitoring dashboard to visualize how the monitoring systems are performing. And obviously, once you set up monitoring, the logging mechanisms are important from an audit perspective. So configure logging, and then based on the monitoring and whatever dashboards that you set, identify what are the anomalies, and once an anomaly is detected, how do you react to it? And finally, application health monitoring and infrastructure monitoring. How do you decouple and how do you match these two? Because they go hand in hand, right? So what is my mechanism to set up my application health monitoring, and how do I translate that, or how do I map it up to the infrastructure monitoring so that I get a holistic view? The next best practice that we are going to talk about is service quotas. As you set up monitoring, as we talk about scale, AWS has service quotas, which are formally referred to as quotas, to protect you from unexpected excessive provisioning, as well as protecting you from malicious actions intended to increase your bill, as well as protect the service endpoints. Similar quotas are often present in SaaS offerings and other third party interfaces. This is not something new that we are talking about. And typically in data centers or office workspaces, there are limitations in network, storage, and compute availability, as we all know. Now, when it comes to service quota management, some of the things that we want to call out is that documenting what the current quotas are for the AWS services, where you may need to talk with AWS support, and configuring and creating systems to create alarms when the service quotas are approached. We'll share a link on how service quotas can be managed using CloudWatch alarms. And there's also one other link we may want to share on visualizing your service quotas and setting up alarms. So some of the AWS services, you can use usage metrics to visualize your current service usage on CloudWatch graphs and dashboard. And you can use a CloudWatch metric math function to display the service quotas for those resources in your graphs. And that creates an environment where you are able to visualize the service quotas and you can set up the alarms. We also want to talk about ODCRs. That is a method that is used to handle the capacity. So ODCRs are nothing but on-demand capacity reservation that enables you to reserve compute capacity for Amazon EC2 instances in specific availability zone for any duration. And one of the questions that normally we get asked is, hey, how about the billing construct for on-demand capacity reservation? So for that, billing starts as soon as the capacity is provisioned and the capacity reservation enters the active state, and you no longer need it. In those cases, what you do is you go ahead and cancel the capacity reservation to stop incurring charges. One other topic that I wanted to touch upon before moving on to the next best practice is throttling. That comes up during the discussions when we are planning for large scale events and anticipated events. When you are architecting for the cloud, you need to keep API throttling in mind, particularly the type of calls and the frequency in which they are called. The frequency is the key there. And when the allocated rate limit for an API call is exceeded, you will receive an error response and the call will be throttled. Now, how do I handle these throttling? I'm pretty sure that anyone operating would have experienced this throttling on different services. And when these throttles happen, the techniques such as exponential backoff, retry, and adding a jitter. Jitter is nothing but adding a random amount of time before making or retrying a request. That increases the reliability of your application, and you can reduce the operational cost for your organization. And we'll share some links around throttling as well. The next best practice that we're going to talk about is scaling. This is the crux in terms of scaling, and all of that we spoke so far, this all leads into scaling, because as I mentioned earlier, the key construct or the variable in case of event management or event planning is the scaling aspect. It could be the same infrastructure, but you're going to operate at a different scale on the day of the event. So what are some considerations when it comes to scaling in preparation for a planned event? Understanding your current footprint, number one. What is my current landscape and how are my services structured? Service dependency analysis. What are my upstream and downstream consuming services, so that I have a clear cut understanding of the service dependency so that I can plan for the scaling accordingly. And scaling expectation. We touched upon this a little earlier. What is the traffic is that is to the infrastructure mapping. So if I'm going to get 2x traffic, how should I scale my infrastructure? 2x traffic always doesn't mean 2x of all your infrastructure components, right? So these things comes with load testing and performance testing that you do in terms of relative scale, where you would say, hey, for a 2x rate jump, this is my scaling plan, or these are the things that I need to scale. And then when we talk about scaling strategy, let me give you an example, right, to put all of this into context. Let's say you are expecting 2x to 3x of your existing baseline operations. Then you may scale to 5x the baseline traffic, approximately, right? And then let's say the baseline itself is like 1000 concurrent users, and then you want to scale for 5000 concurrent users. I'm just giving a relative scale of 1x to 5x. And this kind of a strategy will help you to scale in advance a little ahead. From a capacity management, you call that to be lead capacity, right? Pretty much the same approach when it comes to scaling. You lead the scaling initiative to go slightly above than the expectation, so that you can plan ahead of the event. And then once you have that scale completed, then you will have a minimal plan of execution during the event. So this could be a redundancy plan, if you will, just in case if I may get an additional zero point 0.5 to 0.75x of my existing traffic, that is the scaled up traffic after 5k, whatever 0 0.5 or 0.75x, if I get it, what is my scaling strategy? Is my existing footprint based on auto scaling and other setups, is that sufficient enough? What if something goes wrong? What if one component that fails? What is my immediate reaction? How do I divert the traffic? So those kind of discussions is what you would have at this time of scaling. Cool. The next best practice that I want to bring in is operations readiness. Now that all the planning is all taken care, now we get into the event. So just ahead of the event, you can develop a run book in preparation for the event. And what is a run book, right? A run book is an operational manual that contains procedures and operations that your operators will carry out during the event. So these could be regular ongoing operations during the event, or there could be like a segue into what if condition. So if X happens, these are the set of procedures that we need to carry out. So having a run book always helps so that everybody is prepared and we are not working in the last minute. And then prior to the event, you can create a live metrics dashboard that monitors all the critical components of the services in production. Consider the following components: the components such as, let's say, resource utilization on each server, or web service response time, or let's say web traffic metrics, and how do you map those traffic metrics into user experience. Database server utilization, depending on if your application is doing a lot of writes, and you don't want to get impact to your end users during writes, monitoring the DB server utilization. And last but not least, error logs, right? So those are some of the things that you may want to look at when you get like one or two errors, instead of waiting for a load of errors to come in. So how do you have a mechanism to identify issues earlier and respond to them? And it's all completely up to you, right? These are all just pointers which we want to encourage you to think in these lines. And obviously there are going to be even better practices, and as you work on your run book, it might evolve as you work on your way through your second event and third event and so on. But the end objective here is to have an open line of communication through the event, to have all the relevant parties available for the escalations. So we're going to do a quick sum up of the last two best practices. And the next best practice that we're going to talk about is security. Again, this is not just events, right? We all know security is job zero, by which we mean that it is even more important than any number one priority. So irrespective of event management, irrespective of IEMs, security is going to be the core. And here we touch upon three broad topics. Number one is generic security best practices. That is, again, understanding the shared responsibility model, using least privileges, using trusted advisor as a tool for security recommendation that you can implement. I definitely want to highlight edge protection when it comes to infrastructure events. And here I want to call up on AWS WAF. AWS WAF is a web application firewall that helps you protect your web application or APIs against common web exploits and bots that may affect the availability and compromise security or consume excessive resources. And then the last pointer is on DDoS. So what is DDoS? DDoS is nothing but distributed denial of service attack, and it is a malicious attempt to disrupt normal traffic to a web property. And when we look at DDoS protection or DDoS mitigation, the recommendation is consider AWS Shield. AWS Shield is a managed distributed denial of service protection service, and AWS Shield is offered in two tiers. One is Shield Standard, another one is Shield Advanced. All AWS customers benefit from the automatic protection of AWS Shield Standard, and there is no additional charges. On the other spectrum, in terms of increased defense, AWS Shield Advanced, right? That is something that will help you protect against targeted attacks for higher level security, right? So when I say higher level security, let's say you are protected against attacks that are targeting your application that is running on EC2 ELB, CloudFront, or maybe Global Accelerator and Route 53 resources. And how can you use it? You could subscribe to AWS Shield Advanced, and that provides you additional detection and mitigation against sophisticated DDoS attacks, and also provides you near real-time visibility into the attacks. The last slide that we want to talk about is post-event analysis. I will wrap it up with regards to the post-event analysis. Now that we went through the event and the event is completed, we definitely want to do a post-event analysis as part of the event lifecycle. Why do we want to do that? This will primarily help us to document the lessons that we learned and also take any data points related to root cause analysis if there was a problem that was recorded through the event. So just to classify broadly, retrospective, scaling consideration, and what kind of an optimization that you have to do post-event. And finally, are you planning for any regional expansion with the same footprint? So how do you document that so you can take it further? So just before I wrap up, just to reiterate, if you're planning for any high profile or high impact launches, or you expect a spike in load, reach out to AWS to discuss how we can help you with our AWS event management or AWS well-architected review.
Thanks, Raj. And today, everyone, we looked at some IEM best practices and how they can be used to help your events. If there are any questions that were not answered today, you can post your questions on repos.aws. And please email us any feedback at awssupportsyou@amazon.com. We want to hear from you, so please let us know what you'd like to see on the show. And stay tuned on the AWS Twitch channel. We'll be having Containers from the Couch, where they'll be talking about virtual clusters with Kubernetes. So stay tuned. Thanks for joining us at AWS Supports You, and happy cloud computing.